He walked into the reception as if he had nowhere else to go. Dominic Carter had spent his life making sure glass doors opened for him. Today, he let them close like any other person's. The Lamborghini sat in a different garage, replaced by a borrowed hatchback with a dented bumper and a dull radio that muttered static. His suit was thrift-store navy. His cufflinks were cheap brass, polished badly. He kept his head down, one hand tucked into a worn messenger bag, and he let the receptionist, who knew his wife by name but not him, lead him through polished corridors that had once been his world. Outside, downtown moved with its indifferent pulse, delivery bikes, a coffee cart, and the low hum of a city that would forget someone passing through the lobby within an hour. Inside, the office had the smell of citrus cleaner and expensive coffee. Portraits hung with pristine symmetry. Kelly Monroe's name on the frosted glass still gleamed. He had rehearsed this posture more times than he'd like to admit. Rehearsed the knock, the voice, the moment of vulnerability. Rehearsed how to hide the calculation behind the tremor in his chest. The plan was not a stunt for vengeance. It was a test, a surgical thing. A way to know whether the woman he had married was counting days to take everything they had built. This was a man who knew how to be invisible and how to make himself terrifyingly visible when required. Dominic's empire was built on discretion. He'd learned very young that power could be a private thing, measured more in silence than in press releases. But silence only goes so far when marriage becomes ledger lines and simulated affliction becomes the only way to hear the truth. He stepped into the corridor and nearly lost his nerve. A secretary glanced up. Kelly's assistant passed him with a nod. He said, "Excuse me, Kelly Monroe, I need to talk with her. It's urgent." His voice fit the part, raw, frayed. The assistant checked a calendar, frowned, and let him wait in a leather chair that cost more than his borrowed jacket. Dominic felt ridiculous and dangerous and small all at once. 3 floors up, Kelly's office opened onto the skyline, floor-to-ceiling glass framing a city he had once thought of as theirs. He remembered the day they'd signed the papers for the penthouse, the champagne, the jokes about who would keep which antique, the way she'd laughed when he proposed that they never, ever keep secrets about money. The memory flashed warm and incandescent. Then another set of memories crept in. Dinner tables where the silence was louder than conversation. Calendars that ruled their lives like stern parents. Nights when she closed the bedroom door early and left him with the television's blue glow and the absence of her voice. He watched her through the glass before he walked in.
Kelly had changed the way people appear changed. Tighter jaw, the kind of composure that suggested she had learned to weigh each sentence in smaller, safer increments. Her hair was impeccable. Her posture said she belonged on that skyline and had little patience for anything that suggested otherwise. She did not look up when Dominic opened the door. "Kelly?" he asked, softer than rehearsed now because seeing her, really seeing, undid the theatrical edge. Her head turned. For a second, something private passed between them. Shock, then the professional mask that slid into place because they were, after all, still in public. She excused herself from the person at her desk and crossed the space with the easy efficiency of someone who managed crises for a living. "Dominic," she said, surprise folding briefly into the cadence of her voice. "Is everything—" He should have left it at that. He should have smiled, said something light, and retreated with a dignity that would be preserved in private. But 2 weeks earlier, he had overheard something on a call in his car that had hollowed out his chest and replaced it with a meticulous anger. He hadn't slept properly since. He'd woken at 3 in the morning with the taste of it lining his teeth. The argument in his head had become a quiet decision. Find the truth, then act before the truth became a ledger entry that worked against him. "I lost everything," he said. The words were a husk. He let his voice break at the end, let the office fill with a story she understood even if she had not expected to hear it from him. Bills, creditors, a lawsuit. Pick an unsexy disaster, and he made it sound plausible. He had learned to make ruin credible. The part of him that ran companies knew how to make a story believable. A handful of plausible details, a photograph pulled out for show, a voice that trembled at precisely the right beat. She sat him down at the little conference table nearest the window, and the city pressed against the glass like a jury. There are moral lines people draw and redraw for themselves. Dominic had not wanted to cross this one. But marriage had started to look like a negotiation disguised as a partnership, and the call he'd heard had convinced him that patience might cost him everything. So he did what he had to do. He acted like a man who had nothing left to lose in front of the woman who might be waiting to collect on a calculation she had made long ago.
At first, her reactions were automatic kindness. She offered a glass of water. She folded a napkin into a square as if waiting for a punchline. She asked about creditors, employment, and whether he wanted her to call someone. It felt like she had for years, competent, quick, protective. He believed for a moment that maybe she would be herself again. Maybe this was a test he'd misread.
Then she picked up the phone to excuse herself to a colleague, and the voice on the other end said a name that dropped in his stomach like a stone. Jessica. Dominic's breath went thin. Jessica, his wife's confidant, had been a name that recurred in late-night texts, coffee shop conspiracies about timing, and the kind of casual counsel that could become dangerous if handed to the calculating. He watched Kelly speak for a full minute before the lag between the two of them narrowed his world to a single line he would later replay until it cost him sleep. "When we wait until after the bonus clears, everything shifts," Kelly said, in a tone both businesslike and almost conspiratorial. "He'll still be emotionally volatile, but legally, if the vesting goes through at the end of December, we can secure the stock. Jessica, this is what I told you. We don't move before then. We let the year close." She didn't say divorce or file. She didn't have to. Dominic heard the implication as clearly as daylight. The language of vest and bonus and after the year closes sketched out a timeline. No, a strategy. He had imagined many things: a sudden, clean break, petty infidelity, a fight in a hotel lobby. He had not imagined that their partners would be charting a course like corporate officers, aligning dates to dodge the edge of equitable shares. His heart hammered through his thrifted shirt. He wanted to burst into the doorway, pull her into the hallway, and ask her to explain. He wanted to shout that he had spent half his life building an empire beneath them both, and that she couldn't sell him on the numbers like a spreadsheet. Instead, he moved a smaller, bleaker measure forward. He let the call continue, let the words land as if by accident in the room between them, and he cataloged every syllable. "They'll never see it coming," Kelly said, and there was a hint of satisfaction, quiet and chilling, behind the logistics. "If Dominic thinks I'm the one who will be caught off guard, we have them both fooled." That last sentence, casual and cruel in its simplicity, hardened into an accusation that made Dominic feel like he had been punched in the ribs. He sat very still while the minutes after the call ticked past. Kelly excused herself and left him there with the city's light and the hum of air conditioning, both of which seemed suddenly like accomplices. He left the office without making a scene. He walked out the same door. The valet outside knew him, but today he walked past the valet toward a parking lot where Marcus, an old friend and one-man logistics team, sat in a car with a cup of cooling coffee. Marcus had the look of a man who had been told an ugly truth and not been surprised. He slid out of the driver's seat and gave Dominic a long look. "Did you get it?" Marcus asked. No small talk, no pretense.
Marcus had been that once reliable cornerstone, the friend who would drive at midnight, the man who'd carried 100 secrets without complaint, the one who had loaned Dominic not just cash in college, but a willingness to shoulder awkwardness when plans required it. Dominic did not answer immediately. Instead, he replayed the scene in his head, the glass, the assistant's frown, the casual voice on the other end of the phone. He told Marcus what he had heard, leaving out none of the malice implied by timing a legal move around a bonus schedule. Marcus listened, folding his hands on the steering wheel. "She said vest," Marcus said at length, as if tasting the word like something sour. "She said the year. Damn." They had been raised to name things accurately. When you do that, you can fight them with your eyes open. Dominic felt simultaneously vindicated and sickened. The vindication came from the clarity. If Kelly had really been preparing for a timed filing, then months of quiet distance had not been happenstance. It was preparation. The sickness came from the fact that this was how things were settled now, not by conversation, but by schedules and insider counsel, and friends who plotted leverage like chess pieces. Over the next 48 hours, Dominic did the things billionaires do when they feel threatened. He cataloged, he consulted, but he moved with a personal urgency that the money couldn't fix. He sat in his study surrounded by folders that read like the arc of his life: trust documents, stock certificates, valuations. He thumbed through pages that had been signed and notarized before he turned 30. They were numbers and signatures, but now they felt like fragile, living things with the potential to be misread and misapplied. He summoned Patricia Morrison. He chose her by reputation, sharp, thorough, and, importantly, the kind of lawyer who understood that in their world, facts often arrived wrapped in press. Patricia arrived in sensible heels and a clear suit, carrying a slim folder of her own. Dominic watched her as she unrolled the facts on his mahogany table like she was untangling something that could cut if handled carelessly.
"State laws vary," she said flatly to begin, and Dominic felt a small measure of relief to hear the caveat. "There are ways to protect assets and there are ways to make claims, but you cannot assume a recording is admissible everywhere. You also can't assume that timing alone will be sufficient to upend a settlement. We work with evidence, not certainties." He told her about the overheard line and the way Kelly spoke of waiting until after the bonus, as if it were a weather pattern to be exploited. He told Patricia about the assistant, the parchment, the exact cadence of Kelly's voice, and the merciless little smile he'd seen flick across her face. Dominic watched Patricia's expression shift from clinical to something colder, an assessment of risk and opportunity.
"If she is planning to wait until a milestone to file, that is relevant," Patricia said. "But it's relevant in ways that you have to prove. Timing might show intent, but it does not automatically change a judge's view on support or division. What gives us leverage is documentation, contemporaneous notes, emails, anything that shows premeditative intent, and we have to be careful about how that material is collected and presented." She said the paragraph with the type of calm that suggested many cases before, many clients with hearts like Dominic's, clients who wanted to be right and wanted to be made whole. She clarified the legal landscape without promising victories, that he could seek distribution protections, that filing first gives certain tactical advantages, that public exposure could become unpredictable. For every strategy she presented, there was a corresponding cost, reputational risk, potential countersuits, a messy press cycle. Dominic absorbed it all with the kind of attention he reserved for investment decks. The calculus, once reductive, now had emotional arithmetic bracketed in. Protect the assets, yes, but what of the man who would be read about in tomorrow's headlines? What of the silence that would follow the rawness of public separation? The decision to turn private pain into litigation was not just legal, it was a life sentence read in the court of public opinion. "Do I file first?" Dominic asked, not for legal advice, but to know where his own conscience tilted. He had never asked for permission to protect himself. He had only asked now whether the road he had been walking toward with measured steps was ethically defensible. Patricia looked at him for a long minute. "Legally, there are reasons filing first can be advantageous," she said, measured. "It sets the jurisdiction, often gives you the first opportunity to frame the claims, and if there's evidence of calculated timing, it can change the negotiation dynamics. But I will not tell you it's a moral cleanse. There are human costs here that money does not indemnify you from." There was another presence in the room, worn into the fabric of Dominic's private life. Jessica, the friend whose counsel had nudged Kelly into the kind of strategic thinking that sounded chilling in Dominic's ears. Jessica had once called divorce a negotiation tactic, in a text that Dominic had seen months earlier and dismissed as cynicism. Now he saw how a friend's pragmatic cruelty had mutated into something sharper, perhaps unanticipated by her at the time. Patricia suggested a course of action that balanced tactical advantage with procedural caution. Gather admissible evidence, document the overheard admissions without suggesting illegal behavior, secure assets where possible, and prepare to file if there was a coherent legal basis. She warned against theatricals. "This isn't soap opera," she said. "A judge will look for facts. The press will look for drama. We work the facts."
Dominic left that meeting with a tightened jaw and a folder of next steps. He felt oddly light as he walked out. Perhaps the relief was that there was a plan, something to do besides replaying words in his head until the edges blurred. Perhaps it was the burden of indecision being handed off to someone whose job it was to be objective. Or perhaps it was the small gratification that came from wielding the tools he had used to build himself, clarity, strategy, and a ruthless preference for outcomes over theatrical morality. But the human engines of consequence were not so easily corralled by strategy. When he called Marcus to brief him, the friend's reaction dissolved into anger and a peculiar form of protectiveness. "You don't test the person you love like that," Marcus said, raw. "Even if she did say it, you heard her say it," Dominic interrupted. He needed Marcus to understand the precision of his cut, to know that this wasn't an act of impulsive spite, but a careful, if brutal, method to make a hidden intention visible. She set a timetable around finances. That's not just private suspicion, that's a plan. Marcus's silence stretched. Then he said, "Are you sure you want this on the record? If this gets messy, it's going to look like a billionaire playing puppet master." Dominic closed his eyes and saw the image Marcus described. The papers, the headlines, the late-night pundits dissecting the love life of someone whose fortune had always been part of his public identity. He had always mistrusted the way wealth could make your private pain a commodity. And yet, wealth also meant people attempted to time their exits around him in ways that were merciless. He thought about Kelly's line, "We don't move before then," and the way it had been said with the same clinical distance with which she once instructed his teams through complex acquisitions. That was the point. The affection had been professionalized. If he had any chance to salvage dignity and some control, he would need more than the overheard fragment. He needed corroboration. Over the next week, Dominic watched the small things. He traced emails that hinted at calendars and dates. He requested benign internal documents from his financial team. He had Marcus reach out to an old friend who, among other habits, maintained excellent records of social calendars. They discovered a dinner invite to Jessica and Kelly that matched the timeline, an odd detail that, while not proof, formed a pattern. For Dominic, patterns had weight. Patterns could be triangulated into probable intent. It is important to say what he did not do. He did not call local stations. He did not leak the conversation for gossip, and he did not posture on social media. The choice to act quietly, to gather facts, was both prudence and a deliberate avoidance of spectacle. But prudence has a cost. You cannot be quiet and not also be cold.
That was the paradox he began to live with, the emotional price of silence, the loneliness of preemptive protection. He attended 2 meetings with Patricia that week that were less strategy and more excavation. They went over financial documents with a forensic patience, dates of vesting, bonus cycles, stock option cliffs. Patricia asked questions with the blandness of someone queasy at gossip, but precise in the translation from suspicion to evidence. "Do you have contemporaneous notes from the time you overheard the call?" she asked. "Anyone who heard it with you?" Dominic told her that he had no legally recorded tape and that his testimony would be an account of the incident. Patricia nodded. "We can work with testimony, but testimony is strengthened by corroboration. That includes emails, calendar entries, anything that shows someone was aware of or had been planning around a certain date." When she left, Dominic sat for a long time in the study by himself, letting those terms settle. Corroboration, timing, testimony. Words that felt like armor, and yet could not numb the ache of betrayal. He took out a photograph from a drawer, a candid from a wedding 6 years ago. Kelly's head thrown back in laughter, his own hair slightly disarrayed, confetti in the air. He had carried that photograph through courtrooms and boardrooms like a small counterproof that something had once been whole. A text arrived from Jessica that night, short, perfunctory. "Hope you're well. Kelly asked me to check on some things re-year-end. We're just being careful." Jessica's habitual lightness sat like a slap across the photograph on the table. She had been the one to whisper strategic counsel into Kelly's ear. Dominic felt the sting of that friendship turning into a conspiracy of practicality. He thought of confronting Jessica, of turning the set on friendship and making it a public unmasking. He imagined the pained look of a friend who had miscalculated the harm of counsel. But that too felt performative. Patricia's words kept returning to him. Human costs are not indemnified by money. There is a failure in making someone pay the emotional toll of their choices out of principle. At night, he found himself sitting awake in the penthouse he had once winked out with a sense of eternal possession. Furniture glowed in lamplight, the city blinked below like a grid of opportunities he had yet to claim. He reached for his phone, thumbed through messages, and paused at a voice memo from an earlier time. Kelly laughing, the nervous, warm laughter of a woman who loved with layers, and who once loved him in a way that made him feel younger and safer. He pressed play and let the memory wash over him like warm rain. For a few minutes he was mournful, like someone who had lost a version of a person. Then the rational part of him, the part that had built companies and hedged risks, reasserted itself. If this was a timing game, he would preempt.
He would make the next move, not as a spectacle, but as a legal, measured response. He hired a small, discreet team to audit potential vulnerabilities, transfer chains, shareholder agreements, and the rarely discussed addenda that could be telescoped into leverage. He was careful, maybe too careful, about how he spent his money publicly. He let rumors ride like low clouds. He did not post photos. He did not accept invitations to charity galas. A public image, he knew, could be turned into a weapon in the hands of a skilled rival. In the meantime, Kelly's behavior shifted in small, telling ways. She began to distance herself even more, communicating through assistants, replying in clipped emails that read like the work of someone practicing being unemotional. Dominic found a note under a plate at breakfast once. 2 words, neat handwriting. Space requested. It was civil. It was performative. It felt to him like confirmation. One evening, late and exhausted, Dominic walked by the fireplace mantel where family photos lived side by side with awards. He thought of a different life. The possibility that there was no malice, only a person who had changed as people do when ambition grows teeth. He considered calling Kelly and asking the simple thing he had not been able to say in months. "Are you planning to leave?" But then he remembered the way she had spoken about timing and the smile she had given at the end of that phone call.
He put the phone back down and made a decision that would change the shape of both their lives. Patricia drafted an action plan. She emphasized caution and documented every step in language that was careful and mechanical, the way lawyers speak when they want to make something irreversible feel reasoned. She suggested initially filing a neutral motion to preserve jurisdiction and to secure the ability to litigate where they could find a favorable posture. She warned that the optics would matter. She explained in plain terms that filing first is a tactical move and not necessarily punitive. You are not filing to punish her, she said. You're filing to protect the assets and to force a transparent negotiation. Dominic signed the engagement agreement in a small private office and watched as Patricia slid the pen back across the folder with a kind of professional empathy. He felt simultaneously detached and steady. The act of signing felt like stepping onto a bridge. Once he crossed, he understood, there would be no neat way to return the photograph on his mantle to a world where their laughter remained uninjured. But the first true rupture did not come from the legal papers. It came from something quieter and more explosive, a voicemail he received on a Monday morning from a number he did not recognize. He almost deleted it, assuming another charity pitch or a mundane inquiry.
He pressed play, and the voice that filled his ears was Kelly's, clipped, cold on the surface, but with a tremor that betrayed the emotional cost of controlled language. "I have counsel," she said. "I am proceeding. I wasn't sure you'd ever understand why. If you want to talk, do it through them." There was no signature, no warmth, just a clinical instruction. The message landed like a verdict. News travels differently when delivered by voicemail than when it's flung as gossip. It had the intimacy of a private rejection and the finality of a formal notice. Dominic listened to that message 3 times. He felt a rush of heat, and then a settling into something quieter, almost grim. He had expected a different first strike, some spectacle, a press release, a suit served in a hallway. This was a slow, efficient withdrawal, the kind that suggests fortification, not chaos. And in that fortification was the antiseptic smell of someone who had turned intimacy into calculation. He called Patricia. "She called," he said. The language felt small in the face of the plan he had assembled, but Patricia understood the weight of the tone in which Kelly's words had been delivered. "She's filing through counsel." Patricia's face tightened, and she set the phone down for a long beat. "We expected that possibility," she said. "We need to move quickly. We secured jurisdiction. We request temporary orders if necessary to prevent dissipating assets. But remember, publicity can change the math. We decide whether to fight in the press or to keep things tight." Dominic thought of headlines. He thought of investors watching company stability curves. He thought of philanthropic boards and trustees and journalists nosing into a marriage that had once been private. He had never wanted to be the man whose divorce disrupted portfolios, but he understood that he had become a variable. He understood that lawsuits were rarely about law. They were about leverage and narrative, and the space between people's wants. He asked Patricia the question he kept trying to avoid. "Is it strange that I feel like I wanted to test her?" She looked at him as if she were cataloging 2 different things at once, the man who loved and had been wounded, and the client who needed counsel. "People test their partners in small ways all the time," she said, "but making someone perform for a verdict is dangerous. It can backfire morally and legally. That said, you had a right to know whether a plan existed. The question now is what you are willing to lose to ensure you aren't taken by surprise." That sentence, "What are you willing to lose?" sat with him like a lit fuse. It was not just a legal calculus. It was a measure of his own capacity for endurance and for reinvention. He could protect his assets, but could he preserve any part of the life that had once been theirs? He did not know. He did know, with a clarity that no courtroom could teach, that there was a wedge between them that had been driven by people who should have been keepers of trust. Jessica, whose good counsel had become dangerous pragmatism, Kelly, who had once pledged partnership, and himself, who had chosen deception to create clarity. They were, all of them, architects of the wreckage in varying degrees. That night, Marcus met him at a small bar, a neutral place, the kind of dimness that allowed for unvarnished truth. "If you file first," Marcus said, voice low, "you will look like the man who was preparing to pull the rug. The press will love that. If you don't, you might lose everything. There is no moral high ground. There's only what you can live with." Dominic sipped his drink and looked out the window, where rain made the lights blur.
He had always thought his wealth meant he could manage consequences. He had been wrong. Money could buy a legal strategy, but it could not buy immunity from regret. The test he had staged had yielded a concrete answer. There was a plan, and it was merciless in its logic. Now, for the first time, he understood the cost of converting private pain into legal preemption. The decision did not feel like victory. It felt like a necessary incision. He made a choice to proceed, but not with the theatricality his enemies might hope for. He would file, but he would keep it tight, a procedural affair rather than a public spectacle. He wanted his control exercised in paper and counsel, and not in press releases. He wanted to protect what he could while minimizing the inevitable human wreckage. On a cold morning weeks later, Patricia slid a single-page filing across his desk. It was concise, legalese wrapped in authority. He felt his pulse quicken at the sight of his signature. He imagined how Kelly would receive the news, whether through voicemail again or through a partner's office. He imagined the terse words she would use. He imagined the fury and the embarrassment and the private reconfiguration of everything they had once promised each other. He signed. As he pushed the pen back across the paper, Dominic felt the room tilt into a new future. There was a satisfaction to the choice, an elemental, strategic calm. But under that satisfaction was a soreness. The knowledge that to act against someone you had loved was to entangle yourself in wounds that money could not soothe. The papers were not yet served. The city continued to rotate on its indifferent axis. Kelly's assistant was still polite. Jessica was still a text away. Marcus still came by with coffee. Patricia still recommended caution. But the point of no return had been inked in the thin bureaucratic script that would be read by clerks and later by lawyers who would slice through niceties to expose the bones beneath. Dominic did not sleep the night he signed. He sat at his kitchen island and pulled out the candid wedding photograph again.
It had become suddenly both evidence of something lost and a stubborn remnant of who he had been. He leaned his head against the cool glass of his kitchen window and thought about what forgiveness might look like if it did not mean reconciliation. He thought of whether he could allow someone to repent without forfeiting the right to protect himself. In the days that followed, the world shifted in an energy that was almost imperceptible. Kelly's affairs tightened. Her emails carried a new precision. Jessica grew distant, her texts short and apologetic in a way that suggested she had begun to see the ripple of what she had set in motion. And Dominic, who had once measured himself in acquisition and expansion, began to measure life in smaller terms. A laugh on the phone with Marcus, a sip of coffee at dawn, a moment of real silence where he did nothing but watch the city wake. One afternoon, when the cold had begun to lace the air, a letter arrived on Dominic's doormat, handwritten, folded in neat creases. No lawyer's stationery, no signature. Inside was one sheet of paper, and in a tiny, almost fragile scrawl, words that read like an admission without the pride of being called at. I'm sorry for how I let money define my love. I didn't know what else to do. K. The note made him think not of reconciliation, but of the thin, human, guilty lines that run under people's decisions. He felt simultaneously stung and offered a sliver of something else, possibility. Forgiveness flickered at the edges of his fatigue, not as a reconciliation, but as a relinquishment of the desire to be consumed by anger. He folded the note and slid it into the photograph's frame, next to the image of them all laughing. There would be consequences. There would be legal filings and negotiations, and perhaps even reputational fallout for people who did not expect the private to become public. But there was also, raw and tender, the possibility of growth, for Kelly to reckon with what she had done, for Jessica to be accountable for counsel that had morphed into harm, and for Dominic to learn not to equate vindication with happiness. He did not know how it would end. He did know this. The test had revealed a truth he could not unhear. It had given him the leverage he needed to protect his assets, and it had also cost him the comfort of a simple, private heartbreak. He had chosen to arm himself with facts, and facts opened doors. Sometimes the doors led to light. Sometimes they led straight into rooms where the air smelled of regret. A week later, as autumn thinned into a brittle cold, Dominic stood at his office window and observed the city like a man learning to read his own reflection on glass. He had taken a step that would change stories and reputations. He had crossed a threshold. The next moves would be shaped by counsel, by humanity,
and by the slippery unpredictability of people who never truly reveal themselves until they have to.
He had expected the legal battle to be the hardest part. He had not counted on the quiet, relentless ache that followed the first signatures, the ache of realizing that winning, as he had always imagined it, might mean little if the victory left him alone with a ledger full of numbers and no common memory left to soften them. A week after he had signed, the world tightened around the edges like a fist. If you love tense marriage dramas, like and subscribe. Stay with this one. The papers were served on an ordinary Tuesday. Dominic had imagined far worse theatrics, a tabloid camera planted by the valet, a viral clip of him being led away, an op-ed speculating on how a man with everything could be brought to his knees. Instead, it arrived in a beige courier envelope slid across an assistant's polished desk between a designer notepad and a tepid cup of office coffee. There was no drumroll, only a small, flat sound that meant officialness. Kelly read it at her own oak conference table, while the city outside glittered with the merciless ease of people doing their work. Her hand hovered over the page for a long time. Dominic watched from a building across town, behind tinted glass, while Marcus sat in the passenger seat and did not say anything. He imagined her opening it in 1,000 different ways, the banal ways people open important mail before they let the gravity of it settle. When she finally folded the paper back into the envelope, her jaw was tight. She called Patricia's office within the hour. The first public tremor was small and precise, a short statement released by Kelly's publicist, measured and corporate. "We are aware of private legal proceedings and will not comment while counsel is engaged." It was the sentence people used to make a private implosion look like a line item on a balance sheet. Reporters noted the contrast between her crisp public line and the visible fragility of her late-night calendar entries. Social feeds began to murmur. Then something else happened that neither Dominic nor Patricia had predicted. A woman in Kelly's team, someone Kelly had mentored, reached out to a reporter with a different tone, not scandalous but sympathetic. She described a boss who had been suddenly distant for months, who seemed preoccupied with numbers and schedule, who had even once made an offhand remark about protecting the work that had sounded odd at the time. The tone was vague enough to be non-libelous, but specific enough to invite speculation. Overnight, pundits who had never set foot in their lives began to mingle speculation with analysis. Headlines are efficient predators. They trim nuance down to a single taut phrase. Dominic saw the headlines and felt a cold displacement that money could not buffer. He was, in public, the very thing he'd feared becoming, a story, a symbol. For people who had never met him, his marriage had become a cautionary tale about billionaire divorces.
For investors, the question was never moral. It was operational. For charity boards, the calculus involved optics. In conference rooms and editorial offices, his private life was rearranged into neat segments for consumption. Patricia moved with her practiced calm. "We will not litigate in the press unless necessary," she said. "We keep this tight and factual. We contest leaks through counsel when appropriate. We pursue privacy injunctive relief if statements cross into actionable territory. But remember, some damage is reputational and cannot be litigated away. We manage risk. We do not get to buy back public history." Her voice was practical. Dominic had no appetite for a press war, but he understood that his silence could be construed as weakness. There would be statements to release, a precise cadence of legal responses, and a team to monitor narratives. He delegated the noise and focused on the moving parts. The real work, he told himself, had always been quieter. Negotiations began in a series of rooms smelling faintly of lemon and coffee. Patricia arranged a preliminary sit-down with Kelly's counsel and a mediator in a private downtown suite. The mediator, a woman with a neutral face and a reputation for unraveling stubbornness, laid out a map, temp orders, confidentiality proposals, and a tentative calendar. Kelly arrived in an understated navy dress, her face composed like a contract, but there was no mistaking the tremor under it. Across the table, Kelly's advocate, someone Dominic had not met before, put a careful case forward. "Ms. Monroe has concerns about the fairness of any rabid, unilateral filings," he said. "She is well within her rights to counsel and to seek security for herself in ways she determines appropriate." Dominic listened. He felt the tides of his own moral failure braid with the facts of the case. He had staged a deception, and there was a cost attached to that. Yet the evidence, what he had heard about timing, the pattern of invitations and calendar entries, the note left on his breakfast plate, took up real estate in his chest like proof. His claim was not a story of righteous retribution. It was an attempt to prevent being timed out of what he had built. The mediator suggested a narrow path forward, temporary orders to prevent dissipation, an agreement to keep financial negotiation under seal, and a neutral forensic review of the vesting schedules. Patricia nodded at each suggestion like the professional she was.
"We want a resolution that prevents irreversible movements," she said, "but we do not have to brandish the entire roster of what we know right away." In private, the conversations were sharper. Kelly insisted she had been thinking strategically for the good of both of them, their assets, the reputations tied to their shared philanthropic work. Dominic thought of the words she had said about letting things vest, the way the term had sounded clinical in the car.
To her, the plan may have been logic. To him, it had been betrayal. At one point, after a terse exchange about stock cliffs and timing, Kelly's counsel leaned forward and said, quietly, "There is a way to settle this without bleeding either side, but both parties need to be willing to acknowledge wrongs without weaponizing them." It felt like a moral armistice. Dominic wanted to believe it. He also knew that in cases like this, the fight was less about morality than leverage. Who had the better timing? Who had first access to the courts? Who could frame the narrative in a way that inclined a settlement to their favor? He had the advantage of filing first. Kelly had the advantage of public sympathy and a narrative that could be spun to suggest callousness on his part. Then Jessica appeared, unannounced, unguarded, at his study door. "I needed to see you," she said before he could invite her in. She was thinner than he remembered and looked as if she had not slept in days. Jessica had the kind of look people wear when their internal defenses have been dismantled. She came in with hands that did not stop moving and a mouth that would not be still. "I thought it would be easier if I said it out loud," she began. "I never meant for this to happen like this." Dominic listened. He had rehearsed every version of this conversation. He had imagined her defensive, angry, implacable. Instead, she broke in ways money could not paper over. She admitted more than he expected. The dinner where the two of them had compared notes about timing, the text she had sent that had read like pragmatic counsel, the offhand suggestion that had metastasized into a plan. "I said things to Kelly because I feared being taken," she said, the words tripping over themselves. "My divorce years ago was ugly. Someone told me to wait, to hold until the stock landed. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was helping. I didn't think," her voice cracked, "I didn't think we'd weaponize it." Dominic's anger burned with the curious neatness of betrayed trust. Jessica had once been a friend who had smiled over late lunches and borrowed a sweater when she said her apartment was cold. Now she was a vector of harm, a small decision that had become a cascade. For a moment he was incandescent, the old urge for retribution flashing hot and reductive. Then something else arrived beneath that anger, an exhaustion that felt older than any headline or ledger. He had seen how trauma makes people pragmatic, how fear calcifies into strategies that serve the scared part of a self. Jessica's fear had guided her advice. It had been selfish. It had also been human. "What do you want me to do with that?" he asked finally, not soft enough to be weakness, but not sharp enough for punitive dismissal. Jessica swallowed. "I want to fix it if I can," she said. "I will tell the truth if it helps. I'll testify. She faltered. The rest of her options a shameful list. "I'll do what you want."
I can't undo what I've said, but I can stop doing more harm. Patricia advised caution when Jessica's cooperation moved from confession into law. If she speaks without counsel, it could complicate things for everyone. Patricia told Dominic, "We can take her statement, we can use it to corroborate timeline and intent, but be mindful, public confessions can create other liabilities." They arranged a controlled meeting with Kelly's team in a neutral office. Jessica, shaking but resolute, recounted how her own experience had colored her advice and how fear had become a strategy she had later regretted. Kelly listened with a face like glass. There was no gratitude on it. There was only the gravity of a woman confronting a friend who had once been an ally and had now become part of what she perceived as an assault. Later that night, Kelly asked to speak with Dominic alone. He agreed. They met in the mezzanine outside the mediator's suite, where the city light slanted glass into long lines. Neither of them sat. They paced a lane carved out between the potted ficus and a bronze sculpture. "I asked for security," Kelly said without preamble. I thought that was reasonable. I was protecting myself. Maybe I was selfish. Maybe I was thinking of the work and how to preserve it." Dominic listened. Her words were not an apology. They were a rationalization that sounded like paperwork, because that was the language she had chosen to love him in. It was intimate and clinical in equal measure. "You turned our life into a ledger," he said. The sentence came out harder than he'd planned. "You used the same tactics you use in acquisitions, only this time the asset was a person." Kelly's eyes softened. "Maybe you're right," she said. "But fear made me practical. I was scared. I thought I could keep both of us safe.
They stood in silence, a silence that wasn't empty, but tightly packed with all the unsaid things they had failed to tend to for years. Neither of them felt resolved. Both of them carried the cost. Back in his study after the meeting, Dominic looked at the wedding photograph and then at the handwritten note she'd left earlier. He thought of Jessica's confession and the way small, frightened counsel could create structural harm. He thought of Patricia's warnings and the thin line between morality and survival. The urge to punish lurked in him, ready and hot. He tamped it down like a smoker tamping out a cigarette. He had to make choices that were legally sensible and humanly bearable. Negotiations resumed.
Patel, the mediator, proposed a settlement structure that included strict confidentiality clauses, a division of certain liquid assets with protection for both parties' philanthropic commitments, and a framework for non-monetary reparations, joint commitments to counseling, public service statements about the human costs of divorce timing, and a mediated acknowledgement by parties that fear had driven choices that harmed more than they saved. "You will never be forced to forgive," Patricia said to him privately. "Forgiveness is a personal labor, but you can choose how public you are about it, and you can choose remediation that reduces collateral damage." The settlement that eventually formed was not a document that made anyone whole. It was a compromise that preserved certain assets, placed temporary orders to protect philanthropic projects, and insisted on confidentiality. It did not recreate laughter in the wedding photograph. It did, however, close certain financial windows in a manner that prevented the worst-case scenario Dominic had feared. There was fallout. Jessica's professional circle narrowed. Some of her clients withdrew. One partner in a small agency chose to distance themselves publicly, citing a misalignment of counsel. Dominic, watching from the edges, felt a complex mingling of satisfaction and sorrow. He was not glad Jessica had lost clients. He felt only the human ache of watching a friend be diminished by a mistake that had never intended to harm at that scale. He privately funded a professional counseling program for Jessica and negotiated a small severance arrangement that prevented her from being crushed by the weight of legal fees. It was not charity he broadcasted. It was an attempt at restitution he could live with. Trevor, the secondary antagonist who had once dated Jessica and who had been quietly sowing discord in late texts and sour counsel, fared worse. When Dominic's team pieced together his involvement, an attempt to monetize the impending separation by feeding tips to certain reporters and advising on timing, Trevor found doors shut. A board he had aspired to join rescinded an invitation. An investor he had courted for a startup backed away, citing reputational risk. For Trevor, the consequences were direct and public. He lashed out on social media for a week, then retreated. In the end, his career lost momentum in a way that was proportionate to his choices. Kelly did what many do when the scaffolding of a life is exposed. She sought help. She began therapy and months later enrolled in a restorative program that demanded accountability rather than theatrical contrition. "I don't want forgiveness to be an ornament," she told her therapist in one of the sessions a friend reported, "but I want to be a person who understands how my choices affected other people." Those words, far from being headlines, were small and hard, things that do not make press, but make a life. Dominic's life changed in other ways.
In the months after the settlement, they had a quiet arrangement, a division of responsibilities toward their foundation, a schedule for private interactions for their children's sake, and a mutual agreement to keep their public statements minimal. The legal dust settled into a rubric for separate lives. There were no dramatic walkaways. There were, instead, the slow, honest, often lonely building of separate routines. Work, oddly, became a kind of balm. Dominic threw himself into a new initiative at his philanthropic arm, a program to fund meditative mental health support for high-pressure professionals, an irony not lost on him, and the project absorbed him in the way work can when life is otherwise in shambles. He found purpose in the labor that felt like something other than survival. And then he met Sarah. They met at a board meeting for a small arts nonprofit Marcus had insisted Dominic attend. Sarah had been a last-minute invite, a consultant brought in to advise on community outreach. She was not a board hanger. She didn't speak in the loaded shorthand of wealthy patrons. She asked about the program's actual impact and about how the nonprofit measured long-term change. Her questions were pragmatic and tender at the same time, interrogations born of curiosity rather than calculation. Dominic noticed her because she listened differently than most. She was not impressed or dazzled. She was simply present. After the meeting, Marcus nudged them together and introduced them, and their first conversation was a slow, normal one about background, city neighborhoods, and a shared disdain for performative charity.
Sarah's laugh was quiet and undyed. It warmed the kind of places in Dominic that had been chilled by public spectacle. Their relationship did not arrive like a lightning strike. It was a sequence of dinners that were not underwritten by PR consultants, of walks through galleries where they argued about art, of late phone calls where they admitted vulnerability in small doses. Sarah's life was not without complication. She had been an only child caring for an aging parent. She had a past marked by career pivots. None of it was glamorous. It was honest. One night, in the small kitchen of Sarah's apartment, no marble counters, no city skyline, he made dinner awkwardly and she laughed at his culinary ineptitude. He told her about the photograph in his mantel and the note he'd tucked into it. "Did you expect any of it to end like this?" he asked. "No," she said, "but you can make it mean something that helps you grow, or you can make it a story that defines you forever. Which do you want?" The question, simple as it was, had weight. Forgiveness was no longer a public performance, but a choice about the future he wanted to live into. He told her he did not want to be consumed by bitterness. He wanted to keep his tenderness even if it hurt, and he wanted to build again in ways that were honest. The months that followed were not neat.
There were flare-ups, a leaked line from a disgruntled former aide, an op-ed from a pundit who reduced their story to a morality play. Dominic learned to let some things go. He learned the difference between fighting a battle that mattered and letting the war consume your life. He remained vigilant with Patricia on specific matters of asset protection, but chose to avoid spectacle. Patricia continued to advise with her customary clarity. "You did what you believed you had to do to protect what you built," she told him in private. "But protect and punish are different verbs. Try not to conflate them." When the settlement was finally filed under seal, the legal portion of this story closed with a thud of bureaucracy and the quiet exhale of paperwork. The documents protected the foundation funds and set boundaries for philanthropic gifts. They included confidentiality clauses, along with a mediated mechanism for addressing breaches. They also included non-monetary elements, requirements for both parties to participate in counseling, and to issue a limited, jointly drafted statement about the human cost of letting fear guide major life decisions. There would be no televised courtroom speech. The settlement read like a set of instructions for two people trying to preserve what still mattered. But legal closure does not equal emotional closure. The months following were the slow work of repair, therapy, awkward holiday dinners, divided trustee meetings. There were moments when a photograph would make Dominic feel like a familiar ghost, and times when a voicemail would still carry the old warmth that made him ache for what had been. Grief is not always grand. Sometimes it's a small, consistent weather that simply changes the shape of days. Jessica, who had cooperated and confessed, rebuilt. With Dominic's discreet assistance, she found a new role in a consultancy where she worked on compliance and ethics training, ironically, teaching lessons she had learned the hard way. She did community service as part of an agreement with a former client and attended group therapy. The market forgiveness curve is slow. People will forgive errors, but not patterns. Jessica's patience with the process was perhaps the purest act of contrition. Trevor retreated to a small town and opened a consultancy that never quite shed his reputation. He called Dominic once, angry and unrepentant, accusing him of ruining his life. Dominic did not respond. Kelly, months later, asked for one final meeting, not in a mediator suite or a boardroom, but at a small neutral cafe near where their school runs intersected. She arrived with flat hair and a jacket that spoke little of status. She looked, Dominic thought, like someone who was trying to strip life down to its essentials. "I wanted to apologize," she said without preamble. "Not for being scared. Fear is human. For the way I made it into a plan without consulting you. For not telling you. For letting trust rot for the sake of security." Dominic had rehearsed 100 responses, some sharp and full of righteous fury, some soft and generative. Instead, he said, "I wanted to know, and when I couldn't hear it, I manufactured a test. I shouldn't have played puppet master. I could have asked." They sat in that neutral air between them. There was no reconciliation offered. There was no spectacular closure. There was an agreement, mutual and unromantic, that both had erred, and that both had to live with that. "Will you forgive me?" Kelly asked, small and childish in a way that made his chest ache.
"I can try," he said. "Forgiveness isn't a single action. It's a choice. Not a return to what we were, not a continuation of the marriage, but—" He hesitated. "But I can choose to stop letting this define me." It was a merciful answer, neither absolving nor cruel. It left room for both of them to remain as full human beings rather than moral exemplars. At the Foundation's annual gala a year later, he stood under warm lights and watched a group of young people who had been part of the program he had started. They spoke about their lives in a way that felt like evidence of meaning. In the foyer, Sarah caught his eye and smiled. He walked toward her, not as a man who had been vindicated, but as someone who had been broken and then remade. He had fewer illusions about how tidy victory could be. The stories about their divorce faded from the front pages. New dramas filled the news cycle. Public memory is short. In private, the ripples remained. His name still trended occasionally, usually in the context of philanthropy or market speculation. But most days he was a man with a job and imperfect joy. One afternoon, while reorganizing a box of old paperwork, he found the candid photograph of their wedding. He set it on the counter and then placed beside it the small folded note Kelly had left earlier. He thought about the ledger lines that had once defined his life and about other kinds of balances, of kindness, responsibility, and intentional living. He made a small donation to a counseling fund in both their names, not as a public statement, but as a quiet act of responsibility. He arranged for a small scholarship for Jessica to study restorative justice. He hired Marcus to run a logistics program at the foundation. Marcus, with his practical steadiness and unshowy loyalty, would be in charge of turning good intentions into reliable systems. There were no grand pardons, no cinematic returns. The consequences had been real, and so had the restorative acts. Dominic learned to measure success not only by acquisitions, but by the degrees of mercy he could extend without losing himself. He learned to protect his interests and still cultivate a capacity for forgiveness without confusion.
In the end, the truth the test revealed was double-edged. It had shown what people were willing to plan for the sake of security. It had also exposed the fragility of turning relationships into strategies. He had protected his assets, yes. He had also paid the emotional cost of his deception, a bill that was not financial, but intimate. That bill was ongoing. The last scene was modest. Dominic and Sarah walked along a quieter neighborhood shoreline in the winter, their breaths brief and visible. The city spread behind them like an old ledger, and the harbor was a calm mirror. They talked about small, human things, books they loved, the kind of breakfast they preferred, the volunteer clinic Sarah wanted to support. He listened, finally, like a man trying to learn how to be present. "Do you regret testing her?" Sarah asked quietly, not in judgment but in curiosity. Dominic thought about nights when he could not sleep, when he had toyed with the idea that certainty would bring peace. He thought about the marriage, about the call he had overheard, about the note she had left on the plate, about Jessica and Trevor, about Patricia's even voice. He thought about the little victories that felt like human growth, Jessica's counseling work, Kelly's honesty in therapy, Marcus's solid friendship. "I regret the tearing," he said, choosing words like a craftsman chooses tools. "I don't regret wanting to know the truth, but the way I sought it, in the public place where she worked, that was a blade. I wish I had chosen another path. I don't think tests are a recipe for love, but I do believe in protecting the life you've built when it's threatened. It's messy. There are costs." Sarah nodded, the ocean air making small sounds in her collar. "And do you think you'll be bitter?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "but bitterness is a practice. So is letting go." They stood in a kind of mutual silence that felt like a pact. Dominic reached for her hand. It was an ordinary human gesture. No fireworks, no triumphant music, just the steady pressure of two people choosing, in small ways, to move forward. At his desk later, he wrote a short note to Kelly, not a lengthy treatise on their failures, but a plain, humane sentence. "I hope you find the peace you said you wanted. I am working on mine." He sent it quietly. There was no reply. There didn't need to be. The act itself was a recalibration of a closure that was not theatrical. This was not a story of clean victories. It was not a morality play with a tidy ending.
It was the slow, honest business of living through the consequences of choices that mixed fear, strategy, love, and pain. The greatest victory, Dominic realized, was not the settlement or the protection of assets. It was choosing a life not centered on revenge, learning to forgive without forgetting, and allowing himself to love again in a less instrumental way. If this story moved you, subscribe and tell us in the comments. Was his test justified?
Would you forgive?